The letter hit the floor of Thomas Calloway's kitchen at 7 in the morning, and by noon, every woman in Dusty Creek, Texas, knew what it said. Not because Thomas told them. Thomas never told anyone anything. He hadn't spoken more than 12 consecutive words to a living soul since the winter of 1878, when they buried his wife Clara in the frozen ground behind the old oak on the east ridge of his ranch. No, the women of Dusty Creek knew about the letter because Postmaster Gerald Fitch had a big mouth and an even bigger weakness for gossip. And when he saw the return address on that envelope, he'd made absolutely certain that the information traveled faster than any horse could carry it. Thomas Calloway was hiring a ranch hand. That by itself would not have been remarkable. What was remarkable was the way Thomas stood in his kitchen holding that letter with both hands, his jaw working like he was trying to chew through leather, his eyes scanning words he had not written and a name he had never heard before. Someone had answered his advertisement in the San Antonio Daily Express. Someone had written back with references, experience, and a formal request to begin work on the 1st of October, 1880, and that someone was a woman. Her name was Theresa Kendrick. He read the letter 4 times, the first time in disbelief, the second time in irritation, the third time because her handwriting was surprisingly steady and direct, the kind of penmanship that suggested a person who did not waste motion, did not waste words, and did not waste time. The fourth time because he had noticed, against his will, that she had referenced 3 separate ranches in the hill country where she had worked, and every one of those foremen had written her a personal recommendation so glowing it bordered on embarrassing. He should have written back a refusal. That is what a sensible man would have done. Instead, he set the letter on the kitchen table, walked outside, looked at the sky for approximately 30 seconds and walked back inside. He found a piece of paper, he found his pen, and he wrote exactly 11 words. You may start on the first. Bring your own bedroll. T. Calloway. He mailed it before he could think too hard about it. That was his first mistake. Or so he told himself, standing in the cold mud of his front yard 3 weeks later, watching a woman climb down from the Dusty Creek stagecoach with a canvas pack over one shoulder, a worn leather satchel in her left hand, and absolutely no expression on her face that suggested she was intimidated by anything in the world. Theresa Kendrick was 26 years old, and she moved like someone who had been working hard since she was old enough to walk. She was not delicate. She was not soft. She had dark brown hair pinned back under a battered, wide-brimmed hat, sun-darkened skin, and the kind of steady brown eyes that looked at a person and simply took inventory without judgment or apology. She wore practical clothing, a canvas duster over a plain shirt and trousers, boots that had seen real work. And when she spotted Thomas standing by his wagon across the street from the stagecoach stop, she walked directly toward him without hesitation. This was the moment every woman in Dusty Creek had been waiting for, though not for the reason Theresa knew. Because here was the truth about Thomas Calloway that the whole town understood and no one said plainly. He was a man who had turned to stone. After Clara died, Thomas had closed himself off with the methodical thoroughness of a man boarding up windows before a storm. He ran his ranch, the Calloway spread, 600 acres of good cattle land with a solid main house and a bunkhouse that hadn't held a permanent hand in 2 years. He came to town for supplies. He paid his debts. He spoke when spoken to, and only then in the minimum number of syllables the situation required. He ate alone. He slept alone. He worked alone. The women of Dusty Creek had noticed him the way women notice a man who is grieving and handsome and clearly, profoundly alone. Thomas was 34 years old, broad across the shoulders, with dark hair going slightly silver at the temples and green eyes so sharp they made people feel examined. He had money enough and land enough, and before Clara died, he had apparently been warm enough. Women remembered that. Beatrice Hollow at the general store remembered how he used to laugh. Prudence McGrath, whose husband ran the feed store, remembered seeing Thomas and Clara dance at the 4th of July celebration in 1876, and how he had looked at his wife like she was the only fixed point in a spinning world. That man had not been seen in 2 years. What remained was quieter and harder and utterly unapproachable. In the 18 months following Clara's death, 3 women had made sincere and respectable attempts to draw Thomas Calloway back into the world of the living. Margaret Holt had brought him a pie in January of 1879 and been thanked politely and sent away before she reached the porch steps. Delia Crane had arranged to sit next to him at the church social in March of that same year and had managed approximately 4 minutes of conversation before he made his excuses and left entirely. June Perkins, who was the boldest of the 3 and considered by most to be the prettiest woman in the county, had ridden out to his ranch in April, knocked on his door directly, and simply told him that she thought they might get along well together and that she was willing to be patient. Thomas had looked at her for a long moment, and then he had said very quietly that he was not available in the way she meant, and that he was sorry. He had said it so gently and so finally that June Perkins had ridden home, put her pride carefully back in the box she kept it in, and told every interested party in Dusty Creek the same thing: leave that man alone. He is not coming back from wherever he went. And everyone had. Until the morning of October 1st, 1880, when Thomas Calloway drove his wagon into town to collect a woman who had not come for him at all. She had come for the work. Theresa reached him before he could cross the street and meet her halfway, which was her first indication that she did things at her own pace. She stopped 2 feet in front of him and looked up. He was taller than she expected, which she noted without particular interest, and said, "Mr. Calloway, I'm Theresa Kendrick. I'm here about the ranch hand position." He looked at her for a moment longer than was polite. Then he said, "I know." She nodded. She did not extend her hand, which surprised him slightly. Later he would understand it was because she was treating this exactly as she would any other employment meeting, which meant she was taking her cue from the employer, and he had not extended his hand first. "I have my references with me if you want to review them again," she said. "I read them," he said. "All right," she said. "Then let's go see the ranch." He turned and walked to the wagon. She followed and climbed up onto the seat without waiting to be helped, which also surprised him. He got up on his side, took the reins, and drove them out of town without another word. The silence lasted the entire 3-mile drive. What Thomas did not know, sitting beside Theresa Kendrick in that wagon and watching the familiar Texas scrubland pass on either side of the road, was that she was carrying something too. Not grief, not exactly, but something adjacent to it. A secret that had weight and shape, one she had been carrying for long enough that she no longer noticed the effort it took to keep her posture straight under its pressure. She had left her previous position at the Henderson Ranch in Careville not because she had finished the season, as she had told Thomas in her letter, but because she had refused an ultimatum. Old Frank Henderson, who was 62 and had buried 2 wives and had absolutely no business considering a third, had decided that Theresa's competence and directness and refusal to be impressed by him were the precise qualities he wanted in a woman who would run his household. He had made her an offer that was not, technically, an offer of employment. She had declined. He had suggested that her refusal made her future references in the hill country complicated. She had packed her bag that night and left before dawn. That was the hidden motive behind the San Antonio Daily Express advertisement. She had been in San Antonio, broke and angry and unwilling to go back to her sister's house in Austin, and admit that the world was exactly as difficult as her sister had always warned her it was. She had seen the advertisement, noted that Dusty Creek was far enough from Careville that Henderson's reach probably didn't extend there, and had written her letter with the careful precision of someone who absolutely needed this to work out. She had not expected Thomas Calloway to actually hire her. She had certainly not expected him to be what he was. The Calloway spread announced itself through a gap in the cedar trees as the wagon rounded the last bend in the track, and Theresa let herself take it in without comment. The main house was big and solidly built, a two-story frame structure with a covered porch running the full length of the front, the paint faded to a soft gray-white by sun and weather. The barn was in excellent repair. The fence lines she could see were straight and maintained. The cattle grazing in the east pasture looked healthy. Someone had been working very hard, very consistently, and entirely alone. She looked at Thomas without meaning to. He was watching the road ahead with his jaw set and his eyes tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour of the morning. This man is running himself into the ground, she thought. That was not a romantic observation. It was a practical one. A ranch this size required at minimum 2 able-bodied people to maintain properly. One person trying to do it alone was going to burn through the herd's quality, the fence lines, and ultimately the land itself within a handful of years. Whatever his feelings about company, he had been right to place the advertisement. She climbed down from the wagon and walked the perimeter of the yard with purpose, examining what she could see with the same inventory gaze she had leveled at Thomas himself. He watched her from the wagon seat and said nothing. After a few minutes she came back. "Bunkhouse?" she asked. He pointed. The bunkhouse was small and clean, which surprised her. One bunk made up with a wool blanket, a small iron stove, a hook on the wall, a window with a wooden shutter that could be latched from inside. It was more than adequate, and whoever had prepared it had done so recently. She stepped back outside. "It'll do fine," she said. "What time do you start?" "Before dawn," he said. "Then I'll see you before dawn," she said. She went back for her pack and her satchel, carried them to the bunkhouse, and closed the door. Thomas stood in his yard for a moment, alone in the autumn sunlight, feeling something he couldn't name and didn't try to. He went back to work. The first week was professional to a degree that would have impressed a military commanding officer. Theresa Kendrick did not make small talk. She did not ask personal questions. She was at the barn before Thomas every single morning, which he discovered on the third day when he came out in the gray pre-dawn, and found the horses already fed and the main stall mucked out. She worked without complaint through the hard, physical, repetitive labor of cattle ranching, mending fence posts, moving the herd between pastures, checking water sources, hauling feed. And she did it with an efficiency that told him she had not exaggerated a single word of her letters or her references. She was also, he noticed despite himself, the only person in recent memory who did not look at him with pity. That was almost more disorienting than anything else. The women in town looked at him like he was a wound that hadn't closed yet. The men looked at him with the slightly uncomfortable recognition of people who were glad his grief was not their grief. Gerald Fitch at the post office looked at him with outright sympathy that Thomas found absolutely unbearable. Theresa looked at him the way she looked at the fence lines and the cattle. She assessed what was there, determined what was needed, and got on with it. There was something almost aggressively normal about the way she treated him, and it operated on him like a strange and unexpected kindness he didn't know how to respond to. By the end of the first week, he had started eating breakfast at the kitchen table instead of standing over the stove, because she was always in the yard by the time he cooked, and it felt slightly ridiculous to stand in an empty kitchen alone when there was a table with 2 chairs, and he was already making enough food for 2 people. He did not invite her, he simply left the back door open. On the 8th morning she came in. She hung her hat on the nail beside the door, the way Clara used to, though Thomas did not let himself make that comparison, and she sat down across from him and ate scrambled eggs and corn bread without saying a word for the first 5 minutes. Then she said, "The northeast fence line has 2 posts that are rotting at the base. They'll be down by winter if we don't replace them." "I know," he said. "I can do it today if you take the south pasture water check." He looked at her. "Can you handle the post digger alone?" "I've been handling post diggers alone since I was 17, she said. He almost smiled. He caught himself. "All right," he said. It was, by any measure, an entirely unremarkable exchange. But Thomas sat with the warm cup of coffee in his hands after she'd gone back out to the yard, and found himself thinking that he had just had the longest conversation he had initiated with another person since last Christmas, when Reverend Stoker had cornered him after the service and asked how he was doing, and Thomas had been too tired and too cold to find a polite excuse. He told himself it meant nothing. He was paying her for her work. That was the entirety of their relationship. He believed himself about that for exactly 11 more days. The thing that broke through his carefully maintained walls was not what he expected. It was not a moment of beauty or softness or sentiment. It was a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks into October, when Theresa was trying to rope a steer that had gotten tangled in a collapsed section of fence near the creek bed, and the steer panicked and went sideways, and Theresa went sideways with it, and Thomas, who had been coming across the south field and saw the whole thing, felt his heart stop in a way it had not stopped for anything in 2 years. He was running before he fully understood that he was running. The steer had pulled loose by the time he reached her, crashing away through the cedar brush and probably now in the next county. Theresa was on the ground, sitting in the creek mud, her hat off and her hair half down from its pin, and she was holding her wrist with her other hand and breathing through her teeth. Thomas dropped to one knee beside her. "How bad?" he said. "Not broken," she said tightly. "Just wrenched." "Let me see." "I said it's not broken." Theresa. The sound of her name in his mouth surprised both of them. He hadn't said it before, not out loud. He had said Miss Kendrick once, and mostly just nothing, the way he mostly said nothing to everyone. She looked at him. After a moment she held out her wrist. He took it carefully in both hands and examined it with a gentleness that was entirely at odds with the rest of his demeanor, turning it slowly, pressing along the bones. She watched his face. He was focused and thorough, and he was clearly frightened, and she recognized that it was not the general fright of an employer worried about losing a worker to injury. It was something more personal than that, and the recognition of it unsettled her considerably. "You're right, it's not broken," he said. He did not let go of her wrist immediately. "I told you," she said. "You could have said you were all right and had 3 broken bones," he said. "I've seen people do it." "I don't lie about things that matter," she said. He finally released her wrist and sat back on his heels, and they looked at each other in the afternoon light with the creek running quietly to their left and the steer long gone into the brush somewhere. And Thomas felt the thing he had been refusing to feel for 3 weeks crack open inside his chest like a fault line giving way. He stood up and offered her his hand. She took it and he pulled her to her feet, and then they were standing very close together because the ground was uneven and the creek bank was narrow, and Thomas did not step back immediately the way he should have. Neither did she. "We should go wrap that," he said. "Yes," she said. They walked back to the main house in silence, but it was a different silence than the one they had been carrying. This one had a current running through it. Theresa sat at the kitchen table, and Thomas found the clean linen strips Clara had kept in the medicine cabinet, which he had never moved, never disturbed, had not touched in 2 years. He sat across from her and wrapped her wrist with the same careful hands, and she watched him do it and did not say a word because she was working hard at not saying something she had no business saying. She had not come here for this. She had come here for the work, for the money, for the breathing room between one difficult situation and whatever came next. She had not come to this worn, closed, painfully lonely man and his 600 acres of good cattle land and his empty 2-story house to feel anything except employed. She said nothing. Thomas tied off the linen wrap and pressed his fingers very briefly once against the back of her hand. It was not a caress. It was barely even a touch. But it was deliberate, and they both knew it. And when he lifted his eyes to hers, there was something in them that Theresa had not seen before, and that she understood immediately was rarely shown to anyone. He stood up and crossed to the stove and put a pot of water on for coffee because he needed something to do with his hands. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," he said, which was not what he meant at all. She picked up her hat from the table and went back to the bunkhouse, and Thomas stood at the stove with both hands flat on the counter, and looked at the wall and had a very serious conversation with himself about the difference between loneliness and genuine feeling, and came to no useful conclusions whatsoever. The next day in town, they went in together for supplies, which was itself something new. Theresa experienced Dusty Creek in a way she had not had time for during her brief arrival. She saw it fully now. The general store run by Beatrice Hollow, who had sharp eyes and an immediately warm manner. The feed store run by the McGraths. The saloon, which she noted and ignored. The church, which she noted and filed away. The stagecoach stop. The post office, where Gerald Fitch stood in the doorway and watched Thomas Calloway walk down Main Street with a woman beside him who was not his wife, and who was laughing not at anything Thomas had said, because Thomas had said nothing, but at something she'd seen, a hen that had escaped from someone's yard and was terrorizing a dog 3 times its size, and Fitch nearly fell out of his doorway. Because Thomas, watching her laugh, had almost smiled again. That was the second time. Beatrice Hollow was at the general store counter when they came in, and she watched them with the practiced observation of a woman who had known Thomas Calloway for 15 years and had never expected to see him walk into her store with any kind of ease in his body. He didn't have ease exactly, but he had slightly less tension, which for Thomas Calloway was practically dancing. Beatrice was 53 years old and had seen enough of people to know what she was looking at. She also had the distinct impression that neither of these two people knew yet what they were looking at, which she found both touching and slightly exasperating. When Thomas went to the back for grain sacks, Beatrice leaned across the counter toward Theresa and said, in a voice that was both warm and entirely direct, "You're the ranch hand." "I am," said Theresa. "You're doing him good," Beatrice said. "Don't stop." Theresa looked at her with those steady brown eyes and said nothing, but a slight color came into her face that she could not entirely prevent. "I'm not," she started. "I know what you're not," Beatrice said pleasantly. "I'm talking about what you are. Which is the first person in 2 years to stand next to that man without treating him like he might shatter. That's worth more than you think." Thomas came back with the grain sacks before Theresa could formulate a response to that, and Beatrice went back to being professionally pleasant and pretended she had said nothing at all. Theresa thought about what she'd said for the entire 3-mile drive home. November came in cold and sharp, the way Texas Hill Country Novembers did, with frost in the mornings that turned the grass silver and a wind off the north that had teeth. The work changed with the season, less about the cattle moving and more about winterizing, about making sure the animals had what they needed against the cold, about checking the roof of the barn for gaps and splitting wood for both the main house stove and the bunkhouse stove. Theresa had started eating dinner at the main house table, not just breakfast. This had not been a formal arrangement. It had evolved the way many things between them evolved, through a series of small practical decisions that accumulated into something that felt, after a few weeks, entirely natural. Thomas cooked simply but adequately. She cleaned up. They talked about the work, about what needed doing, about the weather, about the cattle. Gradually, they talked about other things. She told him about the hill country ranches where she had worked, matter-of-factly, without self-pity, and he listened with the focused attention of a man who did not spend attention carelessly. She told him about her sister in Austin, whom she was fond of, but with whom she shared a tendency to argue about the proper course of Theresa's life. She told him about growing up in the Texas Panhandle, on a small farm that had never been quite enough, about a father who had died when she was 14 and a mother who had been formidable, and who had taught her that the world did not particularly care about your limitations, and it was better to get busy not having any. She did not tell him about Frank Henderson. Not yet. Thomas talked less, which she expected, but he talked more than nothing, which she had not expected when she arrived. He told her about the ranch, about its history, about the years of work that had gone into the fence lines and the water systems. He told her about drought years and good years. He told her obliquely, carefully, about Clara, in the way a person talks around a subject that they can circle but not approach directly. He mentioned her the way you might mention an entire era of your life, not as a person, not yet, but as a context, as the reason certain things were the way they were. Theresa did not push. She understood intuitively that the worst thing she could do was push, and not only because it would have frightened him. She was being honest with herself. In the privacy of the bunkhouse at night with the stove warm and the wind outside, that she was not entirely sure of her own feelings, and she needed to understand them before she made any kind of move at all. Because Theresa Kendrick did not do things halfway, and she did not do things she wasn't sure of, and she was absolutely certain that whatever was happening between her and this man was not simple and should not be treated as such. She admitted to herself one cold November night, lying on the bunk and watching the stove's light move on the ceiling, quite profoundly fond of him in a way that had gone well beyond professional regard. Somewhere around the time, he had wrapped her wrist with Clara's old linen strips and pressed his fingers against her hand, as though he was reassuring himself that she was still there. That memory did something to her chest that she could not quite describe. The complication arrived on the 15th of November, in the form of a man on a black horse who came up the Calloway spread's front track on a Tuesday afternoon, when Theresa happened to be fixing a bridle on the front porch, and Thomas was in the barn. The man was well dressed for a rancher, which was to say he was wearing clothes that were too good for the work and boots that had never seen a fence post. He was about 50, with the kind of smooth, deliberate charm that Theresa recognized as the practiced variety, and when he saw her, he smiled the smile of a man who expects his smile to accomplish things. "Good afternoon," he said. "I'm looking for Thomas Calloway." "He's in the barn," she said. She did not offer to get him. The man looked at her for a moment too long. "You must be the hired hand," he said with an inflection that made the words slightly rotten around the edges. "I am," she said, and went back to the bridle. "I'm Emmett Rusk," the man said. "I own the rolling R spread north of here. Thomas and I are old acquaintances." Theresa looked up from the bridle. She knew that name. She had heard it once from Beatrice Hollow during one of the supply runs, mentioned in a context she hadn't fully caught at the time. Something about land and about a disagreement. "I'll let him know you're here," she said, and went to the barn. Thomas came out of the barn looking at the visitor with an expression that Theresa had not seen on his face before. Not quite hostility. Something harder than that and something more complicated. The kind of look a person has when they are seeing someone they wish they could not see. The conversation between Thomas and Emmett Rusk lasted 20 minutes, and Theresa heard none of it because she went back to her work with the deliberate discipline of someone who understood that some things were not her business. But she watched from the barn doorway when Rusk finally rode away, and she saw the way Thomas stood in the yard afterward with his hands at his sides and his shoulders carrying something heavy. She brought him a cup of coffee. It was the most practical gesture she could think of. He took it and looked at it for a moment and then said, "He wants to buy the east pasture." "Is it for sale?" she asked. "No," he said. "Then that's settled," she said. Thomas looked at her. He was suggesting that a man running a ranch alone might find it difficult to maintain the land properly, that the east pasture was, in his words, being underutilized. "Is it?" she said. "It's good cattle land that I rotate every 2 years," he said. "I know what I'm doing." "I know you do," she said. "I've seen you work." Something in his face shifted. He said that a single man without a proper operation couldn't sustain what his father built. Theresa was quiet for a moment. Then she said carefully, "What your father built is what you've maintained and improved. Anyone who has looked at this land with honest eyes knows that." Thomas looked at her for a long moment, and in the afternoon light with the coffee cup in his hands and the cold wind moving through the yard between them, he looked like a man who had been handed something he didn't quite know how to hold. "Thank you," he said, and this time he said it as if he actually meant it. "Don't thank me," she said, echoing his own words back to him without planning to. He looked surprised. Then he almost smiled, for the third time, but this time it reached his eyes. Theresa turned back to the barn before she did something inadvisable with her face. The snow came in late November, which was unusual for that part of Texas but not unheard of, and it turned the Calloway spread into a white, still world that required doubling up on every task. The cattle needed extra feed. The water troughs needed to be broken open every morning. The wood supply, which Theresa had spent a significant portion of October building up, was suddenly absolutely necessary and not the excessive preparation she'd suspected Thomas thought it was. She did not say, "I told you so." It was not her way. They worked in closer quarters those weeks, necessarily. The cold drove the working day into tighter windows around the warmest parts of the afternoon, and the evenings lengthened in a way that meant more hours sitting at the kitchen table after dinner, with a lamp between them. Thomas had a shelf of books, Clara's, she thought, from their neat placement and the careful way he handled them, and Theresa had her own worn copy of a collected verse that she'd been reading for years. They sat on opposite sides of the table and read, separately, and it was one of the most comfortable things Theresa had experienced in years. She also, one evening, caught herself watching his hands while he read. He had good hands. Large and capable and marked with the honest history of hard work, and when he turned a page he did it with a gentleness that she found disproportionately affecting. She looked back at her book. 2 days later, Thomas spoke first. He looked up from his book across the table and said, "Where did you work before Careville?" She told him about the mathai spread near Fredericksburg, and then about the Ramirez family's cattle operation near Uvalde, which had been the best working experience of her life until the Ramirez family's eldest son had married and moved his wife in, and the wife had found Theresa's presence professionally uncomfortable in ways Theresa had neither created nor desired. "It's a common difficulty," she said. "A woman doing this kind of work." "I imagine it is," he said. "You didn't have any trouble hiring me," she said. "Some men would have." He looked at her for a moment. "You had the best references I'd seen in years," he said. "I wasn't going to be stupid enough to turn that down because of something irrelevant." "Most people consider it relevant," she said. "Most people are mistaken," he said. It was not, objectively, a declaration of anything. It was a practical statement of fact. But the way he said it, the simple directness of it, with those green eyes looking at her across the lamplight, made Theresa's breath do something it had no business doing. She said, "I need to tell you something about why I left the Henderson Ranch." She had not planned to say it. But she had been carrying it, and the weight of a hidden motive, no matter how understandable the motive was, felt like a small betrayal of something that was becoming real between them, and she could not allow that. She told him the whole thing. Calmly, without drama, the way she told all difficult truths with precision and without apology. Frank Henderson's offer, her refusal, his implied threat to her references, the pre-dawn departure. Thomas listened without interrupting, his book closed and his hands flat on the table, his face absolutely still. When she finished, he said, "He threatened your livelihood because you wouldn't accept his suit." "Yes," she said. "That's a significant misuse of authority," he said. "It is," she said. "I wanted you to know because you should understand why I came to Dusty Creek. It wasn't because it was my first choice of location. It was because I needed distance and I needed work, and your advertisement was there. I didn't want you to think I was concealing something from you that you had a right to know." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Do you regret coming here?" The question was so direct and so quiet that it took her a moment to absorb it fully. She met his eyes. "No," she said, "I don't." He held her gaze for a moment that stretched and stretched, and then he said, very simply, "Good," and opened his book again. Theresa looked at her own book for several minutes and registered approximately none of the words on the page. December brought Christmas preparations, which were minimal at the Calloway spread. Thomas had clearly spent the last 2 Christmases doing as little as possible in the way of observance, and the house showed it. No decorations, nothing on the mantel, the practical functionality of a man who had stripped away everything that required emotional participation. Theresa brought a small pine branch in from the yard and put it in a jar of water on the kitchen windowsill. Thomas looked at it when he came in for breakfast and said nothing, but she saw him look at it again in the evening, and there was something in his face that was not quite pain and not quite peace, but somewhere between the two. Beatrice Hollow held a general community gathering at the church on the Sunday before Christmas, the kind of event that was more social than religious, and that everyone in a 20-mile radius attended because it was December in Texas, and people needed company. Thomas had not attended the previous 2 years. Theresa was not in the habit of telling Thomas what to do outside the scope of ranch work, but she said on Saturday morning while they were splitting wood, "Are you going to the Hollow gathering tomorrow?" He set the axe and looked at her. "I wasn't planning to." "All right," she said. She kept splitting wood. After a moment he said, "Were you planning to go?" "I was thinking about it," she said. "I don't know many people in town yet. It seemed like a reasonable opportunity." Another moment passed. "I'll drive you in," he said. "You don't have to," she said. "I know I don't have to," he said. They went to the gathering together. The entire assembled population of Dusty Creek and the surrounding ranches watched Thomas Calloway walk through the church door with Theresa Kendrick at his side, and the wave of noticing that passed through the room was almost visible. Beatrice Hollow, standing near the punch bowl, had the expression of a woman whose most optimistic assessment of a situation has just been confirmed. Thomas navigated the room with the visible discomfort of a man who had forgotten how to exist in social spaces, and Theresa navigated it beside him with the calm practicality she brought to everything, which turned out to be exactly the right approach, because she made the introductions natural and easy by simply introducing herself to people, which allowed Thomas to be present without having to perform. She met the McGraths, who were pleasant and curious. She met Reverend Stoker, who was warm and genuine, and who shook Thomas's hand with a relief that was almost comically transparent. She met June Perkins, who was beautiful and gracious, and who looked at Theresa with an expression that was not hostile but was very thorough, and then looked at Thomas with something that might have been wistfulness, and then looked at both of them together with the expression of a woman who is seeing something clearly and accepting it with good grace. She also met Harold Tate. Harold Tate was the county land clerk, 43 years old, with an office in Dusty Creek and a connection to the legal mechanisms that governed property boundaries in the county. He was a dry, precise man who became unexpectedly animated when he had had 2 cups of the punch, which, Theresa suspected, contained something more potent than fruit juice, and he pulled Thomas aside near the fireplace and spoke to him for several minutes in a low, urgent voice. Theresa watched from across the room. Whatever Harold Tate was saying, it was putting Thomas's jaw into the rigid set she'd come to associate with Emmett Rusk and the subject of the East pasture. She didn't interrupt. But when Thomas came back to her side, she looked at him once, and he looked at her, and he said very quietly, "He's filed a boundary survey request on the East pasture. Rusk. He's claiming the old survey marks are inaccurate." "Can he do that?" she said. "He can claim it," Thomas said. "Whether the claim holds is another matter, but it means lawyers and surveys and time, and while it's pending, the pasture is technically disputed." This was a trap. That much was clear. Not a legal trap exactly, but a pressure tactic, Emmett Rusk using the mechanisms of the law to apply friction until Thomas found it easier to sell than to fight. "Who does the survey?" she asked. "County brings in an independent surveyor," he said. "Takes weeks, maybe months. The land was surveyed when my father acquired it in 1861. The marks should be verifiable if they haven't been disturbed." Theresa was very still for a moment. "Have you walked the east boundary recently?" she said. "Not since summer," he said. "We should walk it," she said, "before the surveyor comes, and we should document what we find." He looked at her. "If the marks have been tampered with," she said very carefully, "we need to know before anyone else gets out there with measuring equipment." Thomas looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "When?" "Monday morning," she said. "First light." They walked the east boundary on Monday morning, 2 days before Christmas, in cold, clear air with frost still on the ground. Thomas carried the original survey documents from his father's deed box, which Theresa had never known existed but which contained a meticulous hand-drawn map of the original boundary markers, 3 large limestone rocks with chiseled crosses, positioned at specific intervals along the east edge of the property. They found the first marker without trouble. The second, further along the fence line, was there but had been shifted. Not dramatically, maybe 6 inches. But the chisel mark was on the eastern face instead of the southern face, which was where it should have been according to the original documentation, and the ground around the base of the rock showed signs of disturbance that were inconsistent with natural settling. Theresa crouched beside it and looked at it for a long time. Thomas stood over her shoulder looking at the same thing. "That didn't move on its own," she said. "No," he said. "Rusk," she said. "Who else has a reason?" he said. They found the third marker undisturbed, which meant the tampering was targeted, move one marker enough to create ambiguity in the boundary, without making it obvious that deliberate interference had occurred. Thomas took measurements and wrote them in his field notebook with the exact precision of a man who had inherited his father's, understanding that land was everything and needed to be defended like a living thing. Theresa sketched the marker positions relative to the fixed landmarks visible from the fence line, a distinctive double-trunked cedar, a rock formation along the creek, creating a secondary record that was independent of the official survey documents. "Take this to Harold Tate," she said. "He's the one who told me about the filing," Thomas said. "I think he was trying to warn me." "Then he's already on your side," she said. "We go to him with this and we get it into the record before Rusk's surveyor arrives." They were back in town by noon. Harold Tate looked at the documents, the sketches, the measurements, and the photographs Theresa had made by pressing paper to the marker and rubbing it with a lead pencil to capture the chisel mark orientation. He looked at them for a long time. Then he looked at Thomas and said, "This is going to require a formal legal response." "I know," Thomas said. "You'll want to ride over to the county seat and speak to a lawyer," Tate said. "Take everything you brought me, the original deed documentation and everything you gathered this morning." "I'll go Thursday," Thomas said. "I'd go tomorrow," said Tate. They went the next day. It was Christmas Eve. The county seat was Llano, 15 miles away, and they rode there on horseback because the roads were better for horses than wagons in the post-frost mud, leaving before dawn and arriving mid-morning. The lawyer they found, a careful, middle-aged man named Dawson who had an office above the feed store and a reputation for unflappable thoroughness, went through their documentation with the methodical satisfaction of a man who enjoys a case with good paper evidence. "The displacement is significant because of the documented chisel orientation," he said. "The original survey notation specifying the southern face is your strongest single piece of evidence. If the rock has been moved to place the mark on the eastern face, that's not ambiguity, that's alteration." "Can you stop Rusk's survey?" Thomas asked. "I can file a counter-motion that requires any independent survey to be conducted with both parties' representatives present," Dawson said. "That means Rusk can't send his people out alone. And with your secondary documentation," he nodded toward Theresa's sketches, "we have a contemporaneous record that establishes the marker's displaced position before the official survey, which removes Rusk's ability to claim the position was always that way." Thomas looked at Theresa. She was looking at the lawyer's desk with the focused expression she wore when she was filing information, and she was quietly holding together something that Thomas was only beginning to understand was a considerable intelligence behind those steady brown eyes. "Do it," Thomas said to Dawson. "All of it." They were back on the road to Dusty Creek by early afternoon on Christmas Eve, and the world had the particular quiet of a day when most people were indoors, and the cold had softened slightly toward something almost gentle. They rode side by side on the narrow road through the cedar, and the silence between them was entirely comfortable. After a while Theresa said, "Your father built something worth defending." "Yes," Thomas said. "And you've kept it worth defending," she said. He looked at her. The afternoon light was doing something to her face, not flattering in any artificial sense but honest, the way light in the winter is honest, showing things plainly. He was looking at her and she was looking at the road ahead, and he felt the thing in his chest that had been cracking open since the afternoon at the creek bed break a little further, and he thought about Clara. Not with the fresh grief that used to come with that thought, not with the breathtaking, suffocating absence. With something more like a settled tenderness, the way you hold something precious after it has passed out of the immediate into the permanent. Clara was permanent. She would always be part of this land, part of his history, part of who he was. And she was gone. He was not gone. He had been behaving as though he were for 2 years. He could see that now with uncomfortable clarity, the way you can sometimes see a thing you have been standing too close to once you take a step back. "Theresa," he said. She looked at him. He had a great many things he could have said. He was not, by inclination or practice, a man who said them. But he had learned in the last 2 months that Theresa Kendrick responded to directness, that she respected it, that she returned it in kind, and that there was a specific kind of courage in it that he recognized and admired. "I am glad you came to Dusty Creek," he said. "I'm glad it was you who answered that advertisement." She looked at him for a moment. Color came into her face that was not from the cold. "I'm glad it was your advertisement I answered," she said. They rode the rest of the way home in the quiet, and it was a different kind of quiet from every other quiet they had shared. It had warmth in it. Christmas Day at the Calloway spread was simple and unexpectedly good. Thomas produced, from somewhere in the back of the pantry, a jar of preserved peaches and a slab of smoked ham that had apparently been there since October, and Theresa made cornbread and a dried apple cake using the winter stores and the cast-iron baking pan she'd found hanging unused on the kitchen wall. They ate at the kitchen table in the early afternoon with the small pine branch still in its jar on the windowsill, and Thomas gave Theresa a new pair of leather-work gloves, good ones, from the saddler in Dusty Creek, and said nothing about having bought them, just set them on the table beside her plate that morning. She looked at them and then at him, and she said, "These are good gloves." "Your others are past saving," he said. "They are," she agreed. She had made him something too, which she presented after dinner with the slightly brisk efficiency of someone giving a gift who is not accustomed to giving gifts and finds the performance of it mildly uncomfortable. It was a small leather-bound notebook she'd picked up from the dry goods shelf in Beatrice Hollow's store, and she'd spent several evenings in the bunkhouse writing in it the complete record of the East Boundary Survey measurements, marker descriptions, position relative to landmarks, the rubbing of the chisel marks, in a clear, organized hand, duplicating and supplementing the documentation they'd taken to Dawson. "A second copy," she said, "in case something happens to the originals." Thomas turned the notebook over in his hands. He opened it and read a few pages. He closed it again. "You made this," he said. "It took a few evenings," she said. "It's practical. You needed it anyway." "Theresa," he said, "it's not a Christmas gift exactly, it's more of a—" "Theresa," he said again, and his voice was different, and she stopped. He was looking at her with those green eyes, and the expression that she had started to understand meant he was about to say something real. "It is a Christmas gift," he said, "and it is an extraordinarily thoughtful one. Thank you." She held his gaze for a moment. "You're welcome," she said. After the table was cleared and the dishes done, they sat by the fire. Thomas had built a fire in the parlor fireplace. The first time Theresa had been in the parlor, and she had noticed the framed photograph on the mantel of a young couple, him younger and a young woman with light hair and a direct smile. And she had understood without asking and had not looked at it long, only long enough to acknowledge it silently. And they drank coffee, and Thomas, in a voice that was carefully quiet, told her about Clara. Not around the edges this time. He told her who Clara had been. A rancher's daughter from Fredericksburg, practical and funny, who had ridden better than he had and had known more about cattle medicine than most veterinarians, who had wanted children and hadn't had them, not for lack of trying, and who had borne that with a determined cheerfulness that Thomas now understood had cost her more than she showed. who had been ill in the autumn of 1878, not dramatically ill at first, just the kind of slow ill that you explain away week after week until the week when it can't be explained away anymore, and who had gone from not quite right to gone in the space of 6 weeks with a swiftness that had left Thomas feeling like the ground had been removed from under his feet and had not been put back. Theresa listened. She did not offer comfort in the form of words because she understood that what he needed was not comfort. It was witness, and she gave him that with the whole of her attention, sitting still in the chair across from him with her hands quiet in her lap and her eyes never leaving his face. When he finished, he looked at the fire for a long moment. Then he said, "I have been behaving for 2 years as though this ranch is something I am maintaining until it ends, as though I am going through the motions of a life rather than living one." "I know," she said gently. "You changed that," he said. "I want you to know that I'm aware of it. I'm not saying it to make you feel any particular obligation. I'm saying it because you deserve to know the truth." Theresa looked at him across the firelight. She said, "You changed something for me too." He waited. "I came here running from something," she said. "And I told myself that was fine, that I was practical enough and capable enough that it didn't matter where I was going as long as I was going somewhere. And that has been true, generally, for most of my adult life." She paused. "But I would not leave here now for any amount of money or any other opportunity. And that hasn't been true before. Not once. So I wanted you to know that too." The fire crackled. Outside the window, the stars were coming out over the cold Texas sky, brilliant and close the way they only are in winter. Thomas said, "Theresa." "Yes," she said. He crossed the small distance between the chairs and crouched in front of hers, which put them at eye level, which she recognized as a deliberate choice, and he took her hands in both of his the way he had taken her wrist at the creek, with that same careful thoroughness. "I am not good at this," he said. "I was once, and I have been very far from it for a long time." "I know," she said. "I am asking, with whatever clumsiness is required, whether you might be willing to let something begin between us," he said. "I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight. I'm asking whether it's something you would consider." Theresa looked at him for a moment. His face was completely open in a way she suspected it had not been in years, and she understood the courage that required from this particular man, and she felt something in her own chest that she finally, quietly, gave the right name to. She said, "I'm not willing to consider it." He went very still. "I'm willing to say yes," she said. The expression that moved across his face, the relief, the warmth, the almost smile that finally, on Christmas Day in the parlor of the Calloway spread, became an actual smile, was one of the most moving things she had ever seen. It was like watching a room fill with light after a long darkness. He pressed her hands once and then lifted one of them and placed his lips briefly, carefully, against her knuckles. It was an old-fashioned gesture, formal and tender both at once, and it sent a warmth up her arm that had nothing to do with the fire. "Thank you," he said. They sat by the fire for another hour, talking about nothing consequential, about the ranch plans for spring, about a book she'd read, about the kind of easy things people talk about when the important thing has been said and doesn't need to be said again. And there was a rightness to the evening that settled around both of them like something they'd been cold, without for longer than they'd known. January of 1881 arrived with the legal proceedings around the east boundary, generating exactly the friction Emmett Rusk had hoped to create, and absolutely none of the result he'd intended. Dawson's countermotion was filed on the 28th of December, and when Rusk's surveyor arrived in the second week of January to conduct the disputed survey, he arrived to find Thomas Calloway, Thomas's lawyer Dawson, and Theresa Kendrick all present with a complete documented record of the boundary markers and their positions as of the 23rd of December. The marker that had been displaced was examined in the presence of all parties. The chisel orientation was recorded. The gap between the documented original orientation and the current position was measured and notarized. Emmett Rusk was not present himself. He sent a representative, a young man in good boots who looked increasingly uncomfortable as the day progressed, and the evidence against his employer's position accumulated in an orderly fashion. The survey was completed on a Thursday. The formal finding was issued the following week. The boundary, the finding concluded, was as documented in the original 1861 survey, and any subsequent displacement of the markers was consistent with human interference rather than natural settling. The east pasture of the Calloway spread was entirely and unambiguously Thomas Calloway's land. Rusk made no further legal filings. Thomas, reading the formal finding at the kitchen table with Theresa across from him, looked up and said, "It's done." "Good," she said. "I couldn't have moved that fast without you," he said. "The documentation, the timing, that was your thinking." "We did it together," she said. He looked at her steadily. "I am going to need to get better at accepting that there is a we," he said. She felt the warmth of that land somewhere around her heart and said, with absolute seriousness, "You're already better at it than you think." February was the month that the town of Dusty Creek fully and collectively understood what was happening at the Calloway spread. This understanding came to a head at the McGrath's annual late winter gathering, a slightly less formal affair than the hollow Christmas event, held in the big room above the feed store, and involving a fiddle player from San Marcos, and a generous amount of food, and a general social license that allowed for dancing. Thomas and Theresa came together, which was by now expected, but what was not expected, or perhaps was very expected, depending on who you asked, with Beatrice Hollow almost certainly in the latter category, was that Thomas asked Theresa to dance. He was not a graceful dancer. He was the first to acknowledge this, leaning down to say it into her ear over the fiddle music with an expression of preemptive self-deprecation that she found enormously charming. She told him it didn't matter because she wasn't particularly graceful either, which was not entirely true. She was quite a good dancer when she had a partner who could hold a basic rhythm, but what she meant was that it didn't matter. And they danced 2 dances, and Thomas managed both of them with a combination of determination and the specific focus he brought to every physical task he undertook, which, in the context of a dance, resulted in something that was not elegant but was entirely earnest and entirely him. June Perkins watched from across the room and smiled the genuine smile of a woman who is happy for people she wished well. Beatrice Hollow did not pretend not to notice. Gerald Fitch made a mental note of everything so he could report it accurately, which was his version of a gift to the community. Reverend Stoker danced near them once and said, to no one in particular, "Nice to see you here, Thomas," and Thomas said, "Thank you, Reverend," in a voice that had enough warmth in it to make the Reverend look briefly upward in gratitude. After the dancing, on the wagon ride home under the winter stars, Theresa sat close enough to Thomas that their shoulders touched, and he shifted the reins to one hand and put the other around her shoulders in the careful, deliberate way he did things, and she leaned very slightly against his side, and neither of them said anything for the whole 3 miles because nothing needed saying. Spring came to the Calloway, spread the way spring comes to that part of Texas, fast and green and enormous. The cedar started blooming in March, which meant Theresa spent 2 weeks with watering eyes and a stubborn refusal to acknowledge that the cedar pollen bothered her, which Thomas found inexplicably endearing. The cattle were moved to the spring pastures. The east pasture, vindicated and uncontested, was opened for the new season's rotation. New calves arrived in the early mornings, wet and blinking, and Theresa had been present for enough of them by now that she handled them with the expert confidence of someone who understood exactly what she was doing. Thomas watched her work with the calves one morning in the gray April light and felt a fullness in his chest that he recognized was not complicated. It was simply love, arrived at through the side door of practical partnership and daily proximity, and the slow, patient accumulation of knowing someone well. It did not erase what he had felt for Clara. It did not diminish it or compete with it or require that it be forgotten. It was its own thing, particular to Theresa and to the specific man he was now, which was both the man Clara had known and someone shaped by loss and time and 2 years of solitude, and finally, by the arrival of a woman who had come for the work and stayed for something neither of them had anticipated. He told her on a warm April evening, sitting on the front porch after dinner with the first fireflies of the year beginning to appear at the edge of the yard. He said, "I love you." Just that. Directly, the way she would say it if she said it, and he had learned from her that directness was a form of respect. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the fireflies. Then she turned and looked at him with the full force of those steady brown eyes, and she said, "I love you, Thomas." He reached over and took her hand. They sat on the porch together in the warm evening with the fireflies and the stars coming out, and the sound of cattle settling in the far pasture, and the ranch around them breathed in the darkness with the quiet life of something that was being properly cared for. It was Theresa who brought up the practical question, several weeks later, because she was Theresa and she approached things practically, and also because the arrangement they were living with her in the bunkhouse, him in the main house, the ambiguous professional personal territory of their daily lives, was beginning to feel like a fiction that no longer served a useful purpose. She said, at breakfast on a Tuesday morning in May, "I think we should get married." Thomas looked up from his coffee. She met his eyes without flinching. "I'm not being impractical. I'm being the opposite of impractical. We work together every day. We eat together." She paused, in the precise way she paused when she was choosing words with care about each other. The arrangement as it is requires a certain performance of formality that neither of us actually believes in anymore, and I would like, when it suits you, to stop living in the bunkhouse. Thomas looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Was that a proposal?" "It was an observation," she said, "but it can be a proposal if you prefer." "I do prefer," he said. "Theresa Kendrick, will you marry me?" She looked at him steadily. "Yes," she said. "I told you I don't consider things I've already decided." He laughed. Actually laughed, a full, real, unheld laugh, and it transformed his face into something so warm and open and alive that Theresa felt it press against something behind her eyes. She said with great seriousness, "That is a very good sound. I intend to be responsible for it regularly." "I expect you will be," he said. They were married on the 15th of June, 1881, by Reverend Stoker in the Dusty Creek Church, in front of what appeared to be the entire population of the town and a significant portion of the surrounding ranches. Beatrice Hollow had taken it upon herself to organize the reception, which meant the church hall was filled with food and flowers, and the kind of warm social energy that Dusty Creek had apparently been saving up for an occasion worthy of it. Theresa wore a dress she'd had made by the seamstress in Lano, not white. She was too practical for white, which was impractical in every way she could measure, but a deep blue cotton that was both beautiful and, she noted with satisfaction, entirely washable. Thomas wore his best suit, which he had pressed himself with results that were admirable given his general indifference to pressing, and he stood at the front of the church and watched her walk toward him, and his expression was the one she loved most. Absolutely open, completely present, unfractured by guardedness or grief, just Thomas looking at her with everything he was. She walked toward him thinking about the advertisement in the San Antonio Daily Express, about the pre-dawn departure from Henderson's ranch, about arriving in Dusty Creek on a cold October morning with a pack on her shoulder and absolutely no expectation of anything beyond employment. She thought about the first drive to the ranch, and the silence, and the fence posts, and the creek bank, and the wrenched wrist, and the linen wrap. She thought about Christmas Eve on horseback and Christmas Day by the fire, and two people telling each other the truth as the best gift they had. She reached him and he took her hands, and they turned together to face Reverend Stoker, and the Reverend performed the ceremony with the genuine pleasure of a man who had been hoping to do exactly this for 2 years. When it was done, and they were stepping back down the aisle, Mrs. Theresa Calloway, by law and by genuine desire, Beatrice Hollow had tears on her face and was not even attempting to conceal them. June Perkins was smiling with the open warmth of a woman who had accepted her own part in the story and found it, ultimately, a dignified one. Gerald Fitch was committing every detail to memory. Harold Tate, who had been there at the beginning with the boundary filing warning, and who understood that he had played a small but not insignificant role in the trajectory of events, stood near the back with his punch cup and a look of quiet satisfaction. The reception lasted well into the evening. Thomas danced 3 dances, and by the third one he was marginally better at it, which Theresa attributed to practice and stubbornness, both of which she considered among his finest qualities. They drove home in the June dark to the Calloway spread, which was no longer the ranch of a closed and solitary man but something else, something opening, something that had been in the slow process of becoming a home again since October and was now, fully and officially, one. The second year of their marriage was one of the most productive the Calloway spread had seen in a decade. Theresa formalized her role from hired hand to full partner in the operation, not only in the personal sense, but in the practical sense, with Thomas restructuring the ranch's accounting and operation in a way that recognized her contribution explicitly. They hired 2 additional hands, young men from town who were reliable and capable, which meant the physical burden that had been slowly grinding Thomas down over 2 years of solitude was finally properly distributed. They had plans for the East pasture. Good plans, the kind that Theresa had been thinking about since November and had refined over the winter into a practical program for increasing the herd size while maintaining the land quality. Thomas had looked at her plans for 3 evenings, asked precise questions, made 2 modifications that she acknowledged were improvements, and then implemented everything exactly as she had outlined. "You're the best ranch manager I've ever met," he said to her one morning over the plans, with the simple directness that was entirely his. "I've had good ranches to learn from," she said. "You were wasted at every one of them," he said. "You should have had your own operation." She looked at him. "I have one," she said. The smile that produced was worth everything. Emmett Rusk made no further moves against the Calloway spread. The legal defeat had cost him not only the immediate boundary claim but a degree of community standing, since the details of the marker tampering, while never formally prosecuted as a crime, had become sufficiently well known in the county that people who had considered Rusk a respectable businessman began to qualify that view. He sold his North operation the following spring and moved his base of operations to another county, and Dusty Creek did not miss him. Thomas visited Clara's grave regularly, as he always had. He had been doing so alone for 2 years, and when he told Theresa about this, thinking she might have feelings about it, she said, "Of course you do. I'd think less of you if you didn't." She went with him once on a Sunday afternoon in late summer and stood beside him while he stood beside the grave under the old oak on the East Ridge, and she did not say anything because there was nothing to say. She was just there, the way she was always just there, present and steady in his. He looked at the simple headstone Clara Calloway, 1847–1878, beloved, and felt the grief that was always there, settled now into a permanent quietness, rather than the acute, suffocating thing it had been. He thought about what Clara would have made of Theresa, and found himself almost certain that Clara, who had been practical and funny and direct and had ridden better than him, would have approved with characteristic bluntness. He took Theresa's hand on the way back to the horses. She let him and squeezed once. In the spring of 1882, Theresa told Thomas she was pregnant. She told him at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning, in the same direct way she told him everything, watching his face while she said it. She saw the sequence move across him: surprise, then something almost afraid, then something so warm and so open she had to look away for a moment because it was almost too much to look at directly. He came around the table and pulled her against him with both arms carefully, the way he did careful things, and held her for a long moment without saying anything. Then he said against her hair, "Are you well?" "I'm fine," she said. "I'm very well. Don't start worrying about things that haven't happened." "I will worry appropriately," he said. "You'll worry excessively," she said. "That's my prerogative," he said. She laughed into his shoulder. He worried appropriately, or possibly excessively, for the full 7 months remaining of her pregnancy. He did it with great dignity and care, reorganizing certain aspects of the ranch work without telling her he was doing so specifically to reduce her physical burden, which she noticed immediately, and did not call him on because she found it so genuinely touching. She continued working. She was not made of glass, and she told him so on 2 separate occasions. But she also allowed, as the months went on and the physical demands became more significant, for the boundaries of what she took on to adjust naturally, which she considered a sensible response to circumstances rather than any kind of concession. The baby was born in December of 1882 at the Calloway spread, with the town doctor present and Thomas in the next room in a state that suggested he had finally found the outer limit of his capacity for composed endurance. The doctor emerged twice with updates, and the second time said that everything was proceeding normally, and Thomas should perhaps sit down before he fell down. He was not sitting when Theresa called for him. He came in and sat at the bedside and took her hand, which she gave him because she was tired and warm and very glad to see him, and the doctor handed them a son. A boy with Thomas's dark hair and Theresa's steady brown eyes, 8 pounds and 2 ounces, loudly announcing his objection to the cold air of a Texas December morning. Thomas held him with the same careful hands that had wrapped Theresa's wrist, that had pressed her knuckles, that had handed her a cup of coffee in a ranch yard when she needed something to do, and so had he. He held his son, and his face was entirely undone, not broken open this time but filled in, the way a vessel holds water, with something that had no adequate name except the right one. He looked at Theresa. She looked at him. They named the boy James, for Thomas's father, and he was placed in the cradle that Thomas had spent the better part of October building from cedar wood, slowly and carefully, in the evenings after Theresa had gone to bed, in the room adjoining theirs that they had cleaned and repainted and made ready for this purpose. Beatrice Hollow brought 3 pies when she heard the news. Gerald Fitch announced it to the entire town, which this time was exactly the right thing to do. Reverend Stoker offered a blessing on Sunday that, while not mentioning the Calloways by name, was so transparently directed at them that the entire congregation turned and looked. James Calloway grew, as babies do, with the particular combination of determination and impracticality that is unique to the very young. He had his mother's directness. This manifested early, in the form of extremely clear communication about his preferences and his father's focus, which became evident when he was old enough to sit in the barn doorway and watch the horses with the same steady, unhurried attention that Thomas brought to everything. Thomas was a devoted father in the way he was devoted to everything, quietly, thoroughly, with full and genuine attention. He carried his son around the ranch from the time James could hold his head up, narrating the land to him in the low, deliberate voice he used for important things. Theresa watched them sometimes from across a field or from the porch, her husband and her son, and felt the specific fullness of a person whose life has exceeded what she once thought she was allowed to want. In the autumn of 1884, Theresa told him she was pregnant again. He was better at hearing this news the second time. He still came around the table and held her, but with less of the barely contained alarm and more of the pure gladness, which she found she liked even better. James was 2 years old and deeply opinionated about everything. He had recently formed the conviction that he could assist with the horses, which was mostly not true, but which Thomas accommodated with such patient ingenuity that Theresa often had to leave the barn to prevent him from seeing her smile. Watching Thomas Calloway crouch down to explain a bridle buckle to a 2-year-old with the same seriousness he applied to legal survey documentation was one of the great ongoing pleasures of her life. The second child was a girl, born in April of 1885, who arrived in the spring the way spring things arrived on the Calloway spread with force and color, and an absolute refusal to be ignored. They named her Clara because it seemed right, and because Thomas had asked and Theresa had said yes without any hesitation at all, because Clara was part of the land they lived on and the people they had become, and there was no reason to pretend otherwise. She had her father's green eyes and her mother's constitution, which meant she was formidable from the beginning. Thomas held his daughter in the cedar cradle that had held James, and looked at her with those green eyes, and then looked at Theresa, and said something she would remember for the rest of her life. He said, "I placed that advertisement in the San Antonio Daily Express because I was drowning and I was too stubborn to ask anyone to help. I asked for a ranch hand because it was the only kind of help I could bring myself to name. And you came. And you did every single thing I asked for and a great many things I hadn't thought to ask for, and now we are here." He looked at the baby, then back at Theresa. "I don't know how you knew to come. I don't know what a line to make you pick that advertisement out of all the ones in that paper, but I am grateful for it every single day. I want you to know that." Theresa looked at him for a long moment. She said, "I came for the work." "I know," he said. "And I found everything else," she said. He nodded. "So did you," she said. "So did I," he agreed. Clara made a noise of emphatic agreement from the cradle, which made both her parents laugh. The years that followed were good years. Not unmarked by difficulty, there were drought summers and market downturns and the ordinary hard work of a cattle operation in the Texas Hill Country, which did not become easier simply because the people doing it were happy. But happiness, Theresa had always known, was not the absence of difficulty. It was what you carried with you through the difficulty, and what was waiting for you on the other side of it, and what you came home to at the end of the working day. The Calloway spread thrived. The East pasture, properly rotated and managed under Theresa's program, produced consistently well. The herd grew. The 2 ranch hands they'd hired became 3, and then 4 as the operation expanded, and Thomas managed them with a fairness and clarity that produced loyalty and good work. He was easier with people than he had been. Not exactly easy. He was still not a man who made small talk without purpose, but the hardness had gone out of him, replaced by the particular quality of a man who has chosen his life with full awareness and finds it sufficient in the deepest possible way. James grew into a quiet, focused boy who loved the land with the same wordless devotion his father had, who could read tracking signs at 8 that most grown men missed, and who had, by the time he was 10, the kind of patient competence with cattle that told you he was going to be a rancher like his father and his grandfather before him. Clara grew into a bright, direct, occasionally exasperating girl who had an opinion about everything and the courage to express it, who learned to ride before she was 4 and was reading by 5, and who asked questions about why and how and what for that kept her parents on their intellectual toes in ways they found exhausting and deeply enjoyable. Thomas, faced with his daughter's questions, had the expression of a man who is being gently outpaced by someone he is profoundly proud of. Beatrice Hollow remained a fixture of their lives. The wedding pies had been followed by the birth pies and the recovery pies, and the pies sent along, for no particular reason, that arrived every few weeks as long as Beatrice could manage the delivery, which was a long time because Beatrice Hollow was made of something that did not wear out easily. When she finally handed the general store to her nephew in 1891, Thomas and Theresa drove her to the retirement gathering the town held for her and sat beside her the whole evening. And when Beatrice looked at them both over the punch cups she'd been drinking from since before they were married, she said, with the directness that was her own best quality, "I am very satisfied with how all of this turned out." "So are we," said Theresa. The Calloway spread, On a June morning in 1890, 10 years after a woman had stepped off the Dusty Creek stagecoach with a canvas pack on her shoulder and walked directly toward a man who had not expected her and had not known he needed her. Thomas was in the east pasture with James, who was 8 years old and already a better judge of cattle health than most grown men, checking the herd before the day's heat set in. Theresa was on the front porch with Clara, who was 5, and who was being read to from a battered collected verse, the same one Theresa had been reading since before she came to Dusty Creek, and who was interrupting every third stanza with questions that required real answers. The morning light came over the east ridge the way it always had, turning the grass gold before the heat arrived to turn it dry, touching the solid frame of the main house and the good fence lines and the well-maintained barn, running along the spine of the land that Thomas's father had claimed in 1861, and Thomas had held and Theresa had defended, and that now, legally and fully and forever, belonged to their family. Thomas and James came through the gate into the front yard, and James broke into a run toward his mother and sister the way children do when they have been away for 2 hours and the porch looks welcoming. Clara leapt off the porch step to meet him with the absolute conviction that her arrival on the ground would be cushioned by the universe's appropriate respect for her, which James' dutiful older brother caught her through. Thomas came through the gate behind them and stopped for a moment, because he did this sometimes, stopped and looked at the whole of what was here, the yard and the house and his children and his wife on the porch, looking back at him over the heads of their children with those steady brown eyes, and the expression that was not the blank professional inventory he had met in October of 1880, but something warmer and more complex, and entirely directed at him. He walked to the porch. She made room for him on the step. He sat down beside her and looked out at the yard where their children were now engaged in some negotiation that seemed to require a great deal of pointing and argumentation. "Good morning in the east pasture," he said. "Good morning here," she said. He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into his side the way she had on the wagon ride home from the McGrath gathering, the winter they were beginning, and the fit was the same as it had always been, as though it had been measured carefully and found exactly right. "I was thinking," he said, "about the spring pasture expansion. Another 50 acres would let us." "I know," she said. "I've been thinking about it too. We should talk to James Dawson about the northwest parcel before someone else notices it's available." He looked at her. She looked at him with the faint smile that was, by now, the most familiar and most treasured expression he knew. "I love you," he said. "I know," she said. "I love you too." James had defeated Clara in whatever argument had been occurring, and was now performing a victory of such vigor that Clara had adopted the dignified posture of a person who has not lost but has simply chosen to withdraw, and Thomas and Theresa watched their children in the morning light and the June air and the easy, earned, completely real quiet of 2 people who had built something that would last. The Calloway spread endured. The family grew. The land kept producing. And the story of how it had all turned from a lonely man running himself into the ground and every eligible woman in town having given up on ever reaching him, to this was told by Beatrice Hollow with great satisfaction for the rest of her long life, always beginning the same way. Every woman in town had stopped trying, and then the one who came for work arrived, and she hadn't been trying at all, which, naturally, had made all the difference.